Forward Guidance is brought to you by VanEck, a global leader in asset management since 1955. You'll be hearing more about a VanEck ETF later on, but for now, let's get into today's interview. Very pleased to welcome to Forward Guidance Kyla Scanlon, financial educator and author of In This Economy, How Money and Markets Really Work. Kyla, great to see you. Welcome to the show. Tell us what motivated you to write this book.
Yeah. This book was a labor of love, but I'm really glad to share it with the world. Comes out on May 28th, so it's out in the world now. But the reason I wrote this book is because I got my start at Capital Group, and before I got to Capital Group out in Los Angeles, I had gone to university and had tutored and was really just focused on economics education. And when I got to Capital, I realized that there was like a gap in education and how we explained the economy. And so when I left Capital Group, I joined a startup called OnDeck, built out their investment education arm. But the whole time, I really wanted to educate about the economy, talk about the economy. And when GameStop happened, it was kind of the perfect opportunity to do so. And all the content since then has just really been about explaining how money and markets work, as the byline or the title of the book says. And I really want this book to be like a toolbox to understand the economy. So inflation, the labor market, GDP, it's just meant to be a foundational guide to like all these terms that we throw around that like, what does it actually mean? Like, what is inflation? Like, what is the labor market? And so the goal of the book is to be a resource where people can go to learn about these things that we talk about every single day, but sometimes don't provide definitions around.
The inflation and the labor market, those are the things that the Federal Reserve has responsibility over. And you've got a graphic we could put on screen of that. But don't you think, though, that there's so many other things like the Federal Reserve has way more impact on directly, like interest rates and the banking system and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I think that's like the really hard part about the Fed is that all they're doing, or not all they're doing, but a lot of what they do is nudge the economy around. As you know, they can't like really go and hit things with a hammer. They just kind of like push sand around and hope that a sandcastle is made somewhere in the economy, to use metaphors. But I think that there are chapters about the Federal Reserve, and there are chapters about like how the banking system works and how the banks got started. As you know, like the economy is intertwined and it's complex. And so the first chapter of the book is the economic kingdom, which is meant to be sort of a play on like how all of these things that are really big and confusing interact with one another. But yeah, I mean, the Fed has a really tough job, and I think now the question is like, are their tools doing what they even need to do? Like, are rates even the right tool to fight the inflation that we have? So there's more questions than answers with the economy, but this book is just meant to be a guide to the terminology, some of the math, how we get to the conversations that we have about it.
What do you think is some of the most confusing terminology or the terminology that causes the most confusion, either because no one knows what it means or no one agrees on what it means?
I mean, I think that's so many things right now for sure. I think that that's kind of the big problem is that people want to have different definitions to talk about stuff. Like I think one big example of that is statistics of like paycheck to paycheck. And so like there will be a lot of surveys that say like 70% of people are living paycheck to paycheck. But when you go deeper into how that's actually calculated, sometimes the financial services firm that's publishing the data won't even tell you how it's calculated. There's also 3 different ways to measure it. So I think that's just one core example. But then with the labor market too, like we look at the job openings and labor turnover survey to figure out the strength of the labor market. And the response rate to that survey has declined significantly. And so I think like that's another thing too, where the data that we're looking at probably might not encompass what we actually think it means. And of course, we look at a whole slate of data, like we look at different metrics than just jolts or different metrics beyond what surveys are saying. But I think that's kind of one big concern. And then I think inflation is just a core example also. When you tell people that inflation is going down, a lot of times they're like, well, okay, cool. Like, but why aren't prices going down? But that's not what inflation going down means. And so there's so much semantics and economics, and there's so much terminology that you have to understand that I don't think a lot of people do for, and it's not their own fault. But that's why the book was written. Yeah.
And on the spectrum of On this side of the spectrum, it's yes, real GDP is high, inflation is coming down, the unemployment is all the data is good. And look, if there's someone who says that, oh, I feel bad and that the economy is bad, like you're wrong. In the same way that if I feel that the sky is green, I'm wrong. There's data about this. Versus the other side, no, what people feel matter, and the data isn't capturing what people say. And I guess I'm circling around your phrase, the vibe session of 2022, where people's perceptions of the economy was in strong contrast to the data of the economy, economic data. Which side are you on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see it both ways. Like, I think that when there is structural affordability issues, right? Like we have a housing crisis, inflation has been a pressure cooker. We don't have a social safety net. We have no health insurance, like no paid parental leave in most cases, no federal, at least. And so I think that creates a system where, of course, like people are going to have an element of anger and like an element of frustration. And if you're like, but the GDP is going up, that's not going to feel so good. And so I totally get why people would feel bad despite the economic data being relatively okay. I think though, like what I'm not more concerned about, but what I am concerned about is that sometimes I think it's a media literacy problem. Sometimes I do think it is people tricking themselves. Like there was a survey, and you have to take all surveys and polls with a grain of salt. But there was a survey, I'm sure you saw it, it went all over Twitter. But there was a survey that said that 56% of people think that we're in a recession. 49% think the S&P 500 is down on the year. 49% of people think that unemployment is at a record high. And like you can feel really bad about economic circumstances, and you can feel really frustrated that rent is really high and that you might never own a home. But like there's still an element of truth that we have to recognize. Like the S&P is up 12% on the year. Unemployment is at a 50-year record low. And so I think that's where I draw the line, where I'm like, yes, of course, like it makes sense to be frustrated, but you can't like exist in your own reality. Like you have to say like, the S&P 500 is up, unemployment is at a record low. We're not in a recession, but you can still feel bad about your circumstances. And I think that's kind of like, there's the saying, nuance doesn't sell. And I think that's a good example of that. Is it's nobody wants to hear you can feel this way, but you have to recognize truth.
How are the vibes right now?
I am a little concerned, I guess. Most of my vibe checking is on anecdotes, right? I think one interesting thing that we're kind of seeing is like a vibe discrepancy, like a vibe bifurcation. So like the vibes are like very fine, perhaps in real life. Like you go. I'm in New York for talking about the book, and I was on Broadway, and like everybody's out shopping, and of course it's Memorial Day weekend, so there are sales. But I think that's like a sign of consumer strength. Like people are feeling relatively okay. Air travel at a record high. People are flying, they're buying, whatever. But then when you go online, like the discourse is very much negative. And so like that's something that I've been sort of paying attention to. Is I think the algorithms incentivize that sort of anger and that bad behavior. But then when you're outside of the algorithmic identity, things are okay-ish. That people, of course, are still struggling. Like that's where the real life does lie in terms of the housing crisis, not being able to afford childcare, etc. But I think the vibes are okay. But I do think this online versus offline vibe discrepancy is interesting.
Yes. And people are spending so much money in the US, and then they're complaining about how things are so expensive. Do you think that there's a contradiction there? In other words, yeah, the plane ride, it was expensive. Why? You know why? Because you bought it.
Yeah, exactly. If you want things to be cheaper, stop buying things. But I think that like some people would argue that people are going to continue to buy like no matter what. Like you have to still buy groceries, you still have to pay your rent. Like that's how it is. But like we have seen an uptick on services. Like people are spending money on fun things. Like the Taylor Swift concert was huge for a lot of people. And so I think that yeah, I would say like people are spending. They're spending on what they have to spend on, but it seems like a lot of people are spending extra. And I think Connor Sen from Bloomberg Opinion has an interesting theory on this, especially with the rise of like sports gambling, where it's because of the housing crisis, because like people who are in the millennial, older Gen Z age bracket don't feel like they can afford a home, or sometimes can't afford a home. They kind of have this like extra money to go and spend. And so like that could be part of the reason that we're seeing maybe outsized spending in some areas is because of the play money that would go towards like buying a home and living the quote unquote American dream. But yeah, people are definitely still spending money and doing so at all-time highs, you know?
Tell me about Taylor Swift. I know last year her concert. I mean, I heard you say that people are spending on an average of $1,300 for the median spending of the Taylor Swift experience, which is definitely I would consider elevated. I mean, the way that I perceived the narrative last year was like Taylor Swift led us out of the recession. How much of it that versus no? The economy was not in a recession, and if they didn't spend it on Taylor Swift, they would have spent it on Justin Bieber tickets or someone else.
Yeah, a lot of people argue that like the money would have entered the economy anyway. There's somebody who coined the term the post-COVID YOLO economy. I can't remember who said it, but I think there's an element of truth to that. Like, you know, we were cooped up and luckily we're like very well on the other side of that now, but like we were cooped up for a couple of years. But I do think Taylor Swift, like her European tour is starting and Americans are like flying over there to go see her. I think she's a monetary policy tool. I do think she can sort of generate demand. $1,300 on a whole experience, supporting local businesses. It's impressive. I think that money would have been spent otherwise, but I think was kind of what the world needed. You know, for however you feel about her, but it was what the world needed at that time. She was the first $1 billion tour or something like that. It was a substantial drive. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia published, or one of the Federal Reserve banks published exact data on that.
Tell us about the housing crisis. I remember I did an interview, I believe, with Logan Mohtashami, and he, at the beginning of the interview, this is in 2022, he was talking about a housing crisis. I originally thought he meant 2008 type scenario of a downturn in housing prices going down, people insolvency, mortgages, that type of stuff. But he actually just meant kind of the opposite, that housing would remain strong. But again, there's the flip side of housing remaining strong is it's unaffordable. So yeah, when you talk about the housing crisis, I assume you're meaning what Logan meant of housing being too unaffordable, which is different than there being a weak housing market. In other words, it's that the housing market is too strong, not too weak.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the problem. And that's interesting that I had not thought about that. Like when you would say housing crisis, it might mean like prices going down. Like that's what the 2008 crisis was. And now we're talking about housing crisis in terms of, I didn't think about that semantic issue. But that's, yeah, home prices are high. I interviewed the deputy secretary of the Treasury, Wally Adeyemo, about the housing crisis because I think this is the theory, and I don't know if Logan would agree with it, but I do think government policy is going to be one of the key ways out of this. And I spoke to him about like what the Treasury is doing to incentivize the expansion of the supply of housing. Because what's really interesting about the so-called housing crisis is that home prices are really high. One of the main ways to fix it is to build homes in places that people want to live. Like, of course, you can move to the middle of nowhere and buy a house for very cheap, but a lot of people don't want to do that because they need to be near economic centers. But one thing that's interesting about the housing supply is that shelter costs have driven a substantial portion of inflation, particularly in the consumer price index. And raising rates is not going to make housing get cheaper. Like this is a supply side issue that we're trying to solve with demand side tools. And so mortgage rates have skyrocketed. Home prices are very high because of the misbalance between supply and demand, as well as like zoning and NIMBYism. But the Fed raising rates has made it much harder to build homes. And so that's kind of like a funny spot that we're in, where inflation is being driven by something that the Fed is trying to fight with something that's only making it worse. And I think that's like kind of the big, I guess, paradox of the moment is how do you manage that? Like the Fed doesn't have the tools to like say to home builders, like go build homes. Home builders are building homes. Like we are seeing improvements in all of these metrics, but it's going to take time. And I think it's causing a lot of quote unquote bad vibes.
Forward Guidance is brought to you by VanEck. The VanEck Morningstar-wide MOAT ETF, ticker MOAT, has outperformed the S&P 500 for over a decade. How? MOAT strives to achieve a simple but challenging task: buy quality stocks when they're undervalued, and sell them when they're overvalued. Visit vaneck.com/moatfg to learn more. That's vaneck.com/moatfg. Now the disclosures. All investing is subject to risk, including the possible loss of money you invest. Visit vaneck.com to carefully read a prospectus before investing. The VanEck Morningstar-wide Moat ETF is distributed by VanEck Securities Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of VanEck Associates Corporation. Thanks, let's get back to the interview. So tell me about your perception of how changes in interest rates impact the housing market, because high interest rates will curb demand because more people want to get a 3% mortgage than a 7% mortgage. At the same time, it will curb supply. So you have two forces, one pouring water into the tub, another one draining. So do you think high interest rates cause housing inflation, or do you think they cause housing disinflation?
I mean, high interest rates would create high mortgage rates, right? And that would mean that people are much less likely to buy a house, as you said. But I think kind of the particular, so of course, people aren't buying, the demand goes down, so theoretically prices would go down, just based on the laws of supply and demand. But because we've had, we're a couple million homes short, we're gonna have, John Burns has the exact metrics, but we're gonna have to build millions of homes into 2035 in order to meet the demand that we have. And so I think that's kind of the funky part about raising rates with housing is you would imagine that okay, mortgage rates are more expensive. People are no, thank you. But people are still trying to move into homes, and home prices are so high. 1 year between 2020 and 2021, they went up $55,000, which was, I believe, more than median worker makes. And so it's just become this totally unattainable path. And so, yes, normally higher interest rates might curb demand, but I think because of the particular situation that we're in, it's making it worse because they're not able to build at maybe the rate that they would wish because rates are high.
So what might be some potential solutions, and what did the great that you spoke with him, but the Deputy Secretary of Treasury, what are they thinking about? What are they cooking up?
Yeah, that's a tongue twister. Deputies, I always have to do Deputy Secretary of Treasury. But yeah, so they have a lot of financing opportunities, so a low income tax credit to build affordable housing. They've really advocated for mixed use development, so not just residential, not just commercial, but kind of mixing up the two. The Biden administration has put forth $35 billion to convert commercial properties into residential properties. So those are just some of the examples that are going forward. But it's a lot of just how do you incentivize housing supply, and that's through grants and money. And this was not a part of the conversation with the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, but one city that's doing a really interesting job at this is Montgomery County, Maryland. So their government has started essentially just bidding on housing projects because home builders, they have to make a profit. That's their job, to make money off of this. But the government is we don't have to make 20% profit, so we'll just bid and then work with contractors and build complexes. And so they've built one apartment complex that is both affordable and accessible to anybody who might need it, so mixed income. And then they're going to build two more, one of those being senior housing. And so it's really just, I think it's kind of an all hands on deck situation, I think, in really getting innovative in how we think about it, because the zoning laws are so restrictive and they've really prohibited a lot of building. And then the mindset behind housing in the US is sort of funny. I think from 1860 to 1960, home prices only went up by 0.06%. But since then, they've absolutely skyrocketed, and homes have become this speculative asset that you also have to live in. And so it's our way of thinking about housing is so funky because we look at this home and we're this is there's a graph from the Federal Reserve, or bar chart, the distribution of financial assets. And you can see that the bottom 50%, all of their wealth is tied up into real estate, versus the top 10% have equity and stock ownership. They have business ownership and then they own stocks and bonds. And I think that's very telling because if you're part of the bottom 50%, you're looking at this housing market and you're how am I ever going to make the money that I need to live and retire? And we look at homes as kind of a piggy bank, versus the lesson to learn is probably people need to own stocks. They need to be a part of employee stock option programs. The way that we think about housing has to change, because right now you have a group of people, boomers, who are looking at their homes and they're like, I want to sell this for millions and millions and millions of dollars, which makes a lot of sense if that's the way that you're going to retire or if that's your expectation for this speculative asset that you've bought.
As there's a shortage of housing, are you bullish? Not investment advice, but are you bullish on home building stocks?
Yeah, I mean, they have started to build. Like there was graphs showing the home builders are moving and grooving. But yeah, I mean, I think that hopefully it's a good time to build a home. I know that during the pandemic, it was like very expensive for labor and very expensive for the inputs to making a home. But I think that that's just going to, like, if we want to fix a good portion of the economic frustration, I think we have to like have housing be more affordable, and even just like on a cultural level. So I'm kind of young, like I'm 26, but like I have heard stories. So I've always like lived in a very expensive housing environment, and I've never had that opportunity. But like I've heard stories about like people being able to move in the 80s and 90s to New York. There's a very good paper from I think his name is Alex. It's called Negative Yield New York. It talks about how important it is to have accessible housing to build out cultural opportunities, like to move to the big city and feel like you have that opportunity to like become an actor, chase your dreams or whatever. I think housing is prohibiting that for a lot of people. And then a lot of people's income goes towards housing. It's just like, it's something that whenever I talk about it, people are like, that seems easy to fix, like just build more. And of course it's not that easy, or else we would just do that. But I do think it's kind of like one of the big problems that we face and that we have to focus on.
So that claim of, in the 1990s, things used to be more expensive. I'm sure that's true. I'm sure data supports that. Do you think that like people take that narrative a little too far? And also just looking at the like unemployment rate since 1950, the unemployment rate is near historic lows. I mean, it was at 2.9% for a couple months during the 1950s, but now it's at 3.9%. That's lower than pretty much like every single time going back to literally 1970. So this golden age of, oh my God, you could afford everything and blah, 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 blah. It's like, yeah, well, odds are you probably wouldn't have had a job.
Yeah, you could afford housing, but like you're moving to the big city to, try something. And we all know how that goes. But I think it's just more the opportunity. But no, there was a really good piece from the Washington Post over the weekend. I don't know if you saw it, but it was like talking about like when people thought music was best and when they thought the economy was best.
Yeah,
and it was always in their teens because like you didn't have bills essentially.
Yeah.
And like you didn't have anything to worry about but being
everything was free.
Right. Yeah. Like, that's, and of course, like people had to work jobs and stuff.
I used to be able to go to a Yankee game and it cost nothing.
Right. And you're just like, oh, it's so easy being a teen. I love it. That's when things are good.
Yeah, people were a lot taller back then too,
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of like tying into what you're saying. It's so in the piece was very good because they coined this term that I'd never heard of called declinism, which is essentially nostalgia, like looking back on the past and saying, oh yes, everything was very, very good then. But we oftentimes paint a very rosy hue on the past. And so when I referenced the negative yield New York piece, that was more just like about the housing situation because it was cheaper. But like now now housing is like much more, I think it's like 4 times the median income versus it used to be like 3 times the median income. Like housing is quite expensive relative to where we are. But no, I mean, I think the economy that we're in now, and I think the opportunities that I don't think there's ever been like maybe a better time to be alive. I think we're all like really lucky. I think it's really scary. Like I think polarization is, coming towards us. There's a lot of bipartisanship. We keep on bullying other countries, which is kind of nerve wracking. But I think in terms of just being a person, like it's funny when you see people complain about the economy, and I get it. But like the U.S. economy has outperformed every other economy. Like if you're in Europe, it kind of blows. If you're somewhere else, it just kind of isn't so good. And the US is doing relatively well, but and it makes sense like why people are feeling bad for all the reasons that I listed at the top of the show. But it's objectively like can be so much worse. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, what do you want the real estate market of China? I mean, I'd choose US any day.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. Like a bunch of ghost cities. But it's hard. And I spend a lot of time thinking about this. And it kind of drives me nuts because you're trying to understand the human psyche, which is something maybe never to try and do. But, I get it. Like structural affordability is a big deal. Like I live in the economy too. Like I feel these things that other people are feeling, especially like owning my own business. Like there's a lot of pressure, but I think that when you look around and the opportunities that are available, just to like start your own business or to just try something new, like the opportunities are still there. I just there's I'm sort of talking in circles a bit, so forgive me, but there's a really good book called iGen by Jean Twenge. You might have read it, but she talks. So it's good. She talks a little bit about external versus internal locus of control, and she has a couple of research papers that talk about how teens have evolved since the late 1990s to have a more external locus of control. So an internal locus of control would be like, I'm responsible for the things that happen to me. Like the reason that this happened is because I did this. But versus an external locus of control is like blaming the world around you. Like everything sucks because everybody but me is like is the worst. And that's a very reductive summary of a very good book. But I think that's kind of the situation too, is we all have evolved to have a very external locus of control versus maybe an element of agency in how we operate.
Do you think that now just smartphones and people spending 6 hours a day on their phone is making people a little bit more negative, and so that people would tend to have a pessimistic view of the economy and life, even if, let's say inflation was at 0% and nominal growth and real growth were at 6% and the unemployment rate was at 2%. Do you still think there would be doomerism there just because the nature of how information is spread and consumed?
There's a good study that talks about if you have a negative word in the media headline, if you have a negative word in your headline, the click-through rate increases by 2.3%. If you have a positive word, the click-through rate decreases by 1.9%. You make content online, I make content online. We both know that if we have negative words in the videos, like people are more likely to click on it. I A/B test that all the time.
Yeah.
And so I think that's like also part of the deal is that the business model of media, and it's just how it is because of the business model, is incentivized to have more negativity. It's people are much more likely to click on a story that is doomeristic versus positive. Like it's part of our animal brain. It's like we got to protect ourselves, so of course we're gonna click on the story that gives us something to protect versus the thing where like, okay, good, everything's good over there with like the honeybees or whatever, versus like, oh, all the honeybees are dying, right? Um, and so I think that's a big part of it is that the algorithm, the business model, our human behavior incentivize bad news and doomerism versus positivity.
And how would you assess right now wealth inequality and income inequality in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like kind of a big thing too, is wealth inequality sort of has gotten worse. What's been interesting about the era that we're in is that lower income consumers have had massive wage gains. Like they really have sort of caught up in a big sense. But I think in terms of wealth inequality, the disparity has gotten worse. And so I think things are improving on some levels, but getting worse on other levels. And then I think also in terms of other elements of inequality is intragenerational inequality. So the Financial Times, John Byrne Murdoch wrote this really great piece where he analyzed the millennials that were going to inherit homes from their parents versus millennials who would have to go out and purchase their own home, which is like another element of bifurcation in the economy. Another element of inequality is having rich parents, and then also the golden handcuffs too. So if you're able to get in 2020, get a 2% mortgage, that's another gapping point from your fellow cohort and inside of your generation. So I think inequality is very much a big deal. And I think the economy is only becoming more bifurcated, both in terms of sentiment and then in terms of money.
Yeah, I think with wealth inequality, I think one of the biggest drivers just must be how expensive are assets, because if wealthy people have more money and more assets and asset prices go up, by definition it would. But I don't think you want a world in which the stock market has a price to earnings ratio of 6. Like that makes it more equal, but that's probably, I don't know, maybe not desirable. When it comes to income inequality, yeah, you referenced it about lower income jobs having huge gains. Don't you think there was kind of a reversal of that starting in 2020 with COVID and just the massive stimulus? Like these years, kind of 4 years to out of date.
I believe it's more recent than that. It's like post-COVID, the lower income workers, because of like supply and demand mismatch, like people trying to get people back into the labor market and offering, higher wages. Like I'm sure you've seen some of the signs on the side of the highway, like $18 to work at McDonald's. Like there has been more growth for lower income workers in terms of their income levels. Some people will point that out as the reason of an element of frustration. Like there are kind of rolling white collar recessions like in tech and finance. I've seen researchers say that like this almost reverse inequality, I guess, like sort of a closing of the gap might be a reason for some of the anger that we see. Does that sentence make sense?
Yes. In terms of the labor market, you sure, but I'm also talking about like stimulus as well.
Yeah. So no, this is the kind of reversing trend. Sorry, I thought you meant like just in COVID, but yeah, like people's savings rates are going down. We're starting to see credit delinquency rates begin to tick up. I do think like the economy this is just a guess, but I do think the economy is going to have a tougher time moving forward because people did use up the stimulus checks. A lot of the savings balance of COVID has been drawn down. We're entering a much harder labor market. It's much harder to find a job right now than to, like, people who have a job are okay, but much harder to find one. There are a lot of red flashing warning signs going off, unfortunately.
We have our title and thumbnail right there.
Red flashing warning signs.
Yeah, exactly. Kyla Scanlon. Economy
Yeah.
will not be as good.
Oh gosh, yeah.
No, I'm just
That'll
kidding.
go over super well. No, it's a good title. You're right.
So later on in the book, you've got a graph of the inequality curve and the well-being curve over time from 1800 to 2000. So we can put that on screen, and you have an integrative phase and a disintegrative phase and another integrative phase. Can you explain this this chart for people and what it means?
Yeah, that's from Peter Turpin. So he was the person who made that chart, and I just borrowed it for the book. But yeah, I think that if I remember, it's the strange disappearance of cooperation in America. That's the piece that the chart is referencing, and it's just talking about all of the times that we've sort of pulled away from each other, and we're increasingly pulling away from each other. Like communities have declined. Third places maybe don't exist how they used to.
What needs to exist?
Third places.
What's that?
Yeah, so it's like I'm sitting in a WeWork right now. This could technically be considered a third place, but it's kind of a work spot. But it's sort of like a place to go to hang out that isn't your work or home. So like it could be a coffee shop. It could be like the movie or the TV show Friends.
Yeah,
Yeah, that coffee shop that they go to is kind of a third place.
got it. So it's like you go to your library or a
Yeah.
pool or yeah.
Yeah. And so there's been sort of a decline of like community gathering spaces, people say, and that's kind of what that piece is talking about. More than just like the decline of third places, but just like why don't we get along like how we used to?
And when it comes to political polarization, you won't have any argument from me that in terms of Democrat versus Republican, Biden versus Trump, anger, it is at all-time highs and has been extremely high, since 2016. But would you say there's a slight disconnect there in terms of when I think of congressional anger and not being able to pass bills? Started with Obama. I mean, the Republican opposition to Obama was very high, so there was not a lot of legislation being passed. It seems like now, like they go on C-SPAN and talk about how much they hate each other, but when it comes to actually passing bills and spending money, it seems like Congress is kind of doing its job. If you think spending its money is doing its job.
It's their job probably. We pay taxes for a reason. But yeah, I think that like some stuff has gotten stuck. Like, I think there's still an element of frustration, but I think you're right. Like, we got through the debt ceiling debacle. The Biden administration was able to pass the CHIPS Act, the IRA, the IIJA. There's been a lot of good things coming out. And I think that is because for all the polarization, like there still is the desire to pass legislation. We'll see like how everything shapes out into the election, but it's been impressive. Yeah, it's been heartening.
So from your book, page 30, you say banking is akin to an arrangement in which you say, banks, you can earn big bucks by distributing money to the public on behalf of us, the government, and the public will believe in you because we believe in you, end quote. So do you think that that framing that you just laid out shows that the government is in charge of money and that the private sector is and the banking system is kind of allowed by government to allocate credit. Whereas there's a differing view that no, it's the private sector's, has the bank's money is the private sector's money. Can you explain that dichotomy and why you think that money is the government money?
This was a hard chapter to write because of that. I should have probably spent more time analyzing the other viewpoint too. But yeah. I mean, I think that like the government is the one issuing the money, and kind of the faith in the government is the ultimate backing of that currency. So that's why I fall into the latter camp, or the former camp. But yeah, the latter camp makes a lot of sense too. If I guess you have a more libertarian stance. But yeah, the government is sort of the one saying like, okay, banks, this is our money that we're issuing. Here you go. But I think in the U.S. it makes sense to have a view of the other side as well, since it is such an individualistic society. Yeah.
How do you describe modern monetary theory and your views on it?
It makes sense on paper, right? Like MMT is like, okay, governments go spend good stuff. Like, don't worry if it has, just spend money. And I think in theory that's wonderful, but there are second order effects to that. Like if we go and spend a bunch of money and kind of do everything in favor of the U.S., MMT can hurt developing nations, right? Like it can make things more expensive for them because they end up having to follow what the U.S. does. And so I think that's like one part of the issue. And then I think there are consequences to just spending a lot of money. And that's a very reductive summary of MMT, and probably is not a fair summary. And I do it more justice in the book. But I think too, now because the Federal Reserve has been raising rates in order to battle inflation, interest servicing costs on debt has risen substantially on government debt. So there are consequences to spending money, particularly when interest rates are high, because you have to pay interest. And so I think that's kind of, we haven't really heard about MMT because of that, recently at least.
We haven't heard about MMT. Why?
Because interest rates have been high. And so interest cost on government debt has been high. And I this is just speculation, but I think the talk of implementing MMT has gone down because the consequences of spending money are very apparent right now.
So the government has higher interest expense. If the government were a private sector agent, that would probably curb their spending. But I don't think that the government I'm sure Congress people will talk about how the interest expense is a problem, but it's not, I don't think it's actively impacting the level of the deficits like it would a private sector agent. And that is a point I do grant to MMTers, that the government is not a private sector agent. And the analogy of, well, if you spend more than you take in as a household or a business, you're screwed. I don't think the government has those same levels of constraints because they can print money. Do you think that the high level of interest expense is stimulative for the private sector?
Maybe. I mean, I think like it's more so with the interest expense and like what the government thinks about it. It's like I do believe it's about to pass defense spending. It's like really a substantial portion of how we're spending money is these interest payments. And I think it's just something like government debt is useful when it's productive. And I'm totally in the camp that the government should spend money. Like I said, we pay taxes for a reason, and it's the responsibility of a government to provide for its constituents, which is what we are, for its people, which is who we are. And so I think that that's like one big example. Yeah, and I think interest payments are perhaps good for certain sectors of the economy, but I think it's something that is concerning when all of the, not all of the money, but when a significant portion of money is going towards paying off that money, that it can be harmful.
At what point, or do you think there is a point at which the U.S. Government debt is so large that it becomes a problem and it tips into some very adverse scenario? Now I think government debt to GDP for the U.S. is around 120%. When we were kids and it was at 90%, everyone, there were people saying this, going to cause an imminent collapse in the treasury market, and obviously that hasn't happened. But do you think that there is no limit, or do you think that there's a limit, but it's a lot higher from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as it's as long as it's productive. So I think like kind of how we circumnavigated the idea of like, oh, government debt is really bad is because we spent it on productive things mostly, like things that would grow the economy, like the CHIPS Act, the IRA, the IIJA, all of those administration or all of those policies have been stimulative to the point where it might have been counteracting some of the Fed's inflation fight. But I think that if we're not careful, we do run and many have spoken on this, is we do run the risk of Japan. Like we do run the risk of becoming like them with stagflation. That you can't bet against the American consumer, but our demographic situation is moving in a way that's concerning. Childcare costs are up 29%, I believe, since 2019. Elder care costs are also extraordinarily high. And so we have a shift. The fertility rate is very low. We have a lot of older people and maybe not enough younger people to quote unquote replace them or to support them. And I think that's kind of when we could see like government debt getting a little bit weird and us having a Japan like scenario is when as many have discussed, like this is not a new idea, but like when the demographics get funky.
Why do you think elder care and child care costs have ballooned so much and I might add education costs over the past decade, 2 decades?
Yeah, I mean, I think childcare specifically, the regulations are really strict around childcare, and I think they just kind of keep on getting stricter. So it's like you have to have a certain number of workers per child. I believe the number of workers has increased while the number of children that has decreased. So I think it's like you have to, regulation varies from state to state, but like you used to maybe could have one worker per 9 kids, and now you have to have like 2 workers per 9 kids, etc. So I think that's a big part of it. A lot of childcare facilities have shut down post COVID because of the pressures of maintaining a childcare facility. Also, childcare facility margins are like 1%. Like it's razor thin. You gotta like really be in it for the kids, and that is not the case for a lot of people. And so I think that's part of the reason that childcare has gone up so much. And then, a lot of families are dual income. A lot of moms are now staying home because childcare is so expensive, but previously weren't. And so demand for childcare skyrocketed quite a bit. And then elder care is another regulatory sort of deal. But yeah, it's like $10,000 a month. Labor costs, it's crazy. Yeah, it's like, it's really, my grandma is in a memory care facility, and I believe it's like $11,000 a month. And it's really sad because they don't have that kind of money, right? Like, but what do you do? So yeah, it's really tough. So we have these people that need care, and then I think specifically in elder care, there's not enough workers. There's not enough people to take care of those who need like really intensive help, like my grandma does. She has dementia, and so yeah, she needs help, and like, but there's a lot of people who are like that. And then education is a whole monster of administrative bloat. It'd probably be grade bloat to grade bloat.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's quite a bummer. To put it lightly.
So you said for childcare or elder care, the profit margins are razor thin 1%. So the companies are not, making a fortune off this. Maybe they are in terms of scale, but they're not, ripping people off. And the costs have ballooned. So that might make it seem like it was, it's a super high income job to work in elder care or childcare, but I don't believe it is. You gave me so much information and it's very informative, but I don't know if I have an answer to the question. Why is it so expensive? Is it because the children and elderly now are getting so much better care? It's just more expensive in the same way that, now we have a better TV than was available in the 1950s.
No, I think that there's just not enough of them. Like the childcare wait lines are like really long. Like you have to get on lists, especially in New York. Like you have to get on a list to get your kid into certain preschools. So I think that's like part of the reason that childcare costs have gone up so much is that the number of childcare facilities has dwindled post COVID. And so if there's less childcare facilities and just enough amount of kids, the costs are going to go up substantially. Labor costs have increased. sort of, if you have now the demand for, or the regulatory requirement of 2 workers per 9 kids versus 1 worker per 9 kids, you're paying double income all of a sudden, but on the same amount of kids. And so I think it's kind of like childcare is sort of this perfect storm that many have written very good articles about, and very good books too. But yeah, it's really quite dramatic, and like I think the only way out of it is regulation, which is tough because like these are kids. So yeah.
These are kids. So the book is In This Economy, How Money and Markets Really Work. Kyla, I'll ask you a final question. Do you think the vibes will improve? What's your forecast? What's your prophecy for vibes?
I hope the vibes improve. I think that we're kind of going into a fuzzy time with the election coming up, and like there's a lot of uncertainty, which never really makes for a good vibe making scenario. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff. Like the medicines that we're working on as a country are very cool. Summer is always a fun time, but I think that there are problems and opportunities, which I have 2 chapters on in the book about, that we have to address. Problems being the issues that we need to solve, the opportunities being how we solve them.
And so there'll be a lot of uncertainty this year, but maybe there's a lot of mental uncertainty that's already priced into people's minds. So if realized uncertainty is lower than expected, that could be pretty good.
Yeah, that's a great way to say that. Thank you. That's perfect.
There we
Thank
go.
you.
Well, Kyla, thanks for coming on. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for watching. Remember to check out vaneck.com/moatfg to learn more about the VanEck Morningstar Wide Moat ETF, ticker MOAT. Lastly, Forward Guidance is available not just on YouTube, but on all podcast apps, and a video version is available on Spotify and Twitter, where I post interviews regularly. Thanks again. Until next time.